Hello and welcome to the Reviving Town and City Centres Conference, brought to you by ICM, the Business Improvement District for Ipswich, and All About Ipswich, the destination marketing organisation for the town. I'm Terry Baxter, I'm Chair of ICM, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's event. Before we start the conference proper, we'll pause for a moment of contemplation to mark the passing of His Royal Highness Prince Philip. Let's join together to recognise a life of service to this country and the Prince's devotion and support to Her Majesty the Queen and our royal family. Today, across all platforms, we have around 1,000 of you joining us from all over the UK and from overseas, along with so many of you from close to home, from Ipswich and the surrounding areas. Wherever you are today, I hope that you'll find the next 90 minutes or so stimulating, interesting and thought-provoking. Before we move on, I must thank ATCM for their support of today's event and say what a pleasure it's been to work with them to make today happen. Coming up, we have 5 excellent speakers, including Paul Swinney from the Centre for Cities, Minnie Mole, CEO of the Design Council, Steve Walker, Architect and Director from Allies and Morrison, and Paul Clement, our CEO at Ipswich Central. And to comment about today's speakers and discussions, tweet us at IpswichBid using the hashtag #RevivingUrbanCentres. But first, let's kick off with our speakers and OJ MacDonald. OJ has worked with ministers, parliamentarians, economic development professionals, business leaders and placemakers across the UK and Ireland to support town and city centres. He has sat on the Retail Policy Group for the Federation of Small Businesses, the Top Issue Council of the International Downtown Association. He's contributed to the outputs of both the Portus Review and the Future High Street Forum and was lead author of the non-judicial parliamentary inquiry High Street Britain 2015. In addition, OJ coordinates the Secretariat for the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Town Centres. He's a former director of the Institute of Place Management and has a master's degree in politics. Now, that being the case, I'm amazed that he's found the time to join us today. He has, and I'm delighted to introduce him to you. OJ MacDonald.
Thank you so much, Terry, and thank you for the very kind introduction. Just listening to all of that makes me feel a little bit old, if I'm being honest. Good morning to everyone, wherever you are watching this. It's great that we got such a fantastic audience, and I'm pleased because this is such an important event on such an important issue, which is pretty close to my heart. So I'm just going to lay my cards out early and say I'm a fan of Ipswich's vision of a connected town. I do think it's the way forward to a resilient town, and I'm going to explain why. So I've been at ATCM for 13 years. And this image is probably the one that best represents my time at ATCM. It's been an absolutely roller coaster ride. So I started working for the organization as a policy manager back in about 2008. And at that very time, what was happening was something which started off in the US, but would cascade around the globe to cause real disruption at an international level, yes, but most importantly, at a local level, to our high streets, to our town centres. The global financial crash, the credit crunch it caused, the loss of consumer confidence had all sorts of impacts on our town centres locally. And what we've seen over the years since are changes, massive disruption in different ways, whether it's the loss of big brands on our high street, whether it's changes in the mood of the public, a loss of confidence in some of our institutions that look after us that have culminated in some pretty big geopolitical events that have happened since that financial crash. It's been a turbulent time, and up till today, we have yet more turbulence through COVID-19, which has seen something which I'm told isn't even generational, happens probably once every 100 years, a pandemic that has closed our towns and our cities. And it's just weird seeing these places which have used to be so vibrant, so lively, being absolutely empty. And there is no town or city in the world that's been unaffected. Even some of the biggest, most famous cities in the world have lay empty for some period of time because of the pandemic. So this has been a massive challenge for all of us in the urban place management industry, how we get around this, how this impacts our businesses going forward, what we need to do to keep our businesses viable, to keep our towns viable, to keep them relevant. I would go as far as to say COVID-19 is probably a bigger crisis for our towns than the financial crisis. And I'm going to explain why. Ultimately, for me, urban life is built on density. It's built on agglomeration. They are designed for people to come together. Our towns and our cities are about this multitude of social interactions. That's what they have been designed for. Back from the Industrial Revolution, which was the creation of modern day industrial towns and cities, it was about people coming together to work together, people coming together to trade together, about commerce and enterprise and education and all those key things, also community that bring people together in a hub. COVID-19 has been the very enemy of social interaction, and it could have lasting implications for the way we live. The way we live is changing as we speak. But what I'm going to say to you is, while it is a big challenge for us, I think personally, it is just a facilitator for change, which is happening anyway. It itself is not the main cause. And if you want the main cause, we need to delve a little bit deeper into how our social interactions are changing and why. The story of disruption to urban life in the 21st century is not a story about a credit crunch, not a story about a housing crisis that started in the US and cascaded across the world. It's not a story about a virus, a pandemic that keeps us apart. I think this is actually a story of rapid technological change and is something that actually links the two crises together and creates a common thread. Let me explain why. I think what we're living through right now is a different form of industrial revolution, one which is around things like digital technology, and next maybe comes artificial intelligence. Whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to frame it around, ultimately, what it is doing is it's completely reframing the social interactions that govern the very existence of towns and cities. When you look at some of the technological advances we've made in the past few decades, and you take a step back and you try to look at it in its entirety, you come to understand that the rate of technological growth is accelerating. And that you may think of these things like Google and YouTube and the iPad and the driverless car and the word processor, the smartphone, whatever else, all these things are abstract and have make no tangible difference to how our towns and cities look. But I think you'd be wrong in that assumption. I think all of these advances do completely change the way we govern our social interactions. You know, just something as simple as the credit card. You think about it. One of the purposes of the modern day town was for people to come together to trade. I give you a product, you barter with me in return, give me a product, or maybe it's a swap for product for cash. That whole relationship does not need to take place in a specific place anymore because currency can now be digital. Place is not a determining factor for people to be able to trade. I can trade with someone on the other side of the world in real time because of the credit card. Things like social media and how they change the way we communicate with each other, how we work together. The laptop. I've got a picture of this kid. I'll explain to you who this kid is. This kid's name is Ryan. I think he's about 8, 9 years old now. But at the age of 7, he was worth $22 million. And he became worth $22 million because he's mastered the art of communication through YouTube. He plays with toys. Kids watch him playing with toys. He gets lots of hits on YouTube. Paying money for playing with toys. The toy companies understand how successful and popular he is. They give him free toys to play with. They pay him to play with their toys. He is a multi-millionaire in a time of age where there is not a space in the market for a business like Toys R Us. This is how modern technology is changing the game and allowing for all kinds of innovation, new business models that completely changes the way we think about space and place. What was once essential is now discretionary. If we wanted to trade, we had to come together to swap cash for products. We had to come together to work in whatever it would be, a factory, an office. But through Zoom, we no longer need to speak to each other in person. I can speak to many people across the world in real time. Through Amazon, I no longer need to shop in a shop. I can do that from the comfort of my own home. You know, in terms of cinemas, I can now catch the latest movie at home again from the comfort of my own home. What was essential is now discretionary. And so that is fundamentally changing the role of our towns and cities. We need to think about what their future is going to be going forward. I don't know all the answers of what the future of our towns and cities is. What I do know, though, is that applying the basics of good placemaking means that we can make a positive difference and ensure our towns and cities are resilient, regardless of whatever else is changing. Now more than ever, we need to make sure we work on making our places accessible, inclusive, making sure people come first, safety, make sure our places are clean, exciting, and especially multi-layered. I think multi-layered places are incredibly important. This is about co-location. This is about building different uses on top of each other, whether it's workspace, education, urban living, food and beverage, green and blue infrastructure, the kind of footfall generators that will keep people coming into our towns and cities, regardless of whatever Netflix is doing, whatever Amazon is doing. It's a place where you want to be because there is so much going on and there is stuff for you there. Good placemaking is absolutely essential, whatever the time, whatever the place. I think Ipswich's vision of being a connected town is a vision which is timeless. And whether we are looking at an industrial revolution which changes the nature of our social interactions and our relationships with each other, it need not mean the town or the city is going to be any less relevant in the future, so long as we get these basics right. So with that, I'm going to thank you very much, Terry, for the time and the invitation to join you on this journey. And I hope everybody enjoys the event coming forward because there is some really interesting insight coming.
Thank you very much indeed, OJ. Let's just pick up on a couple of things there, or certainly one of the things. I'm really interested in the element of digital that you picked up on and the fact that it's here and we've got to embrace it. How important is it that even with a connected town centre, that we fully embrace the digital way in which we are using town centres and interactions now?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fundamental. And, you know, digital is not there to necessarily bring down towns and cities and the way we speak to each other, the way we communicate with each other. But it can end up being collateral damage unless we understand how people are using digital and make sure we use that to our advantage to help bring people together. It is actually something that could be a force for good if we recognized how to use it. I've seen plenty of instances, examples, where digital has actually created some level of excitement in a town or in a city and brought people in. But it's fundamentally, it's going to be central to people's lives, whether we like it or not. So we've got to roll with digital technology.
We're looking today at Ipswich at some point. Yeah, we're going to have a presentation about our connected town centre. But of course, this is also very much about a national issue. How many towns and cities are embracing this? And I know there's a lot of talk about it, but are we moving quickly enough as a society?
We're probably not. There's a number of big challenges we have in terms of being able to move forward and do the type of work which you're setting out in Ipswich. If I'm being honest, I can probably count on one, maybe two hands, the number of places which are looking at this kind of ambitious project, and it needs to happen in more places. But some of those challenges we have are things like fragmented ownership, where the partnerships, the coordination isn't necessarily there to get the work done that we need to, or to build the vision. That is, working in partnership is incredibly hard. And the challenge we have for our towns and our cities is very rarely is there one organisation that owns the whole lot that can just get things done. That's not realistic in most places. You have local authorities, businesses, landlords, community, whatever else you have to work with. And so being able to find that vision that works for everyone and move forward is a challenge. The other bit is funding. In today's world, where we've seen, cuts to local authority budgets, certainly challenges in taxes like business rates, which make things really difficult when it comes to landlord investment and business investment. Where does the money come to get the work done that we'd like to do on a really ambitious grand scale to really transform our towns and make them properly connected? They are probably the two biggest issues we face at the moment.
OJ, thanks very much for your insight this morning. Right, still to come, we'll be hearing from one of our former directors of the Ipswich Central Bid and now CEO of the Design Council, Minnie Mole. But our next speaker is Paul Swinney. Paul is the Director of Policy and Research at the Centre for Cities, an organisation that helps large cities and towns like Ipswich realise their economic potential through rigorous data-driven research and policy ideas. Paul oversees the research programme and strategy of the centre. He has published on a wide range of subjects relating to urban economies, including the development of UK cities over time, the role that town and city centres play in the national economy, and the trading relationships UK cities have with the rest of the world. Paul is a regular regional and national media commentator, including print, radio and TV, and speaks at conferences across the UK on subjects relating to the performance of city economies. Welcome, please, Paul Swinney.
Thank you very much, Terry, and good morning, everybody. So what I'm going to do is set out the impact that we think COVID has had on cities and large towns and what that means for the future. Is the city dead, as some commentators have proclaimed over the last 12 months? Well, a number of reasons to think that why that's not the case. And so that's why it's really great that we're having this conference today, because I think these sorts of things will underline why thinking about the role that Ipswich plays in the national economy, and indeed other large towns and cities across the UK play in the national economy, is really, really important to, and hopefully a not too distant post-COVID world, as much as it was in a pre-COVID world. So what are those reasons? Well, the first is that cities have existed for over 6,000 years. And they've always been petri dishes of disease. By bringing people together, all the benefits of bringing people together, it also means through that clustering that we do see disease. And indeed, there's, we've not only got a history of pandemics, but we've got histories of plagues, of waterborne diseases, and all these different things that have particularly been centred in our urban areas. And yet, despite that, cities have persisted over that 6,000-year period, or at least a 6,000-year period. And so we can be hopeful that even with the current impact of COVID, that actually the reasons why people come together in cities will continue to persist after COVID has been brought under control, for want of a better word, and all fingers crossed on that front. But you might say to me, well, Paul, you're talking about ancient history there. Yes, of course, it's a long, long period, but now we live in a very different world. And OJ was just talking to us there about the impact of digital technologies. And so, okay, well, the second reason is that if you look over the last 20 or 30 years, where we've had this development of these new technologies, we've had email, we've had Skype, we've had all sorts of other different things, and Zoom now takes priority. We can see that actually high-skilled, high-paid jobs, or so-called knowledge-based jobs, have increasingly been clustered within city centres over that 20 or 30-year period. So in principle, these digital technologies have freed us from, or freed the office from any one location, and people in principle could work anywhere. And despite that, actually, what we're seeing is high-skilled, high-paid jobs, in particular, clustering within the centres of towns and cities. And we especially see that in London, in Birmingham, in Manchester and Brighton, and to some extent in Ipswich as well. Now, these businesses have done that in spite of the cost of doing so. City centre rents have always been more expensive in successful places than suburban or rural locations. And yet these companies have come together. And the question is, well, why is that? Well, that's because of the benefit of face-to-face interaction, being able to share ideas of information, being able to learn off colleagues. And so certain types of companies have always benefited or continue to benefit from that density, from that clustering within city centres in particular. And there's no particular reason why we should think that COVID will rapidly change that. Now, of course, you could say, well, we didn't really sort of know how to use Zoom before, and now the pandemic has completely changed how behaviour is. And we've never sort of run through this sort of experience before. And say, okay, well, let's go to the third point in that case. And because yes, of course, while it's our first rodeo, so to speak, in the Western world about impact of a pandemic, at least sort of in our lifetime, while we've got all these digital technologies available, that's certainly not the case in the Far East. And in the Far East, you've had things like swine flu, bird flu, and SARS, as well as the risk of epidemics or pandemics sort of threatening daily life in the cities of those countries as well over the last 20 years. And yet, despite that, in the last 2 decades, every country in the Far East has become more urbanised rather than less urbanised, and despite the threat of that pandemic. So again, these three things brought together suggest that actually the role of cities is likely to persist, post-COVID, and hopefully, let's say, when we get this under control, and we will go back to that requirement of needing face-to-face interaction, both from a work perspective, but also from a leisure perspective too. So that sort of underlines the importance of the city. Well, then what should the city look like? And so the connected Ipswich idea is a very interesting one. And obviously it's branded as connected Ipswich within Ipswich, but we've got the ideas of the 15-minute city or the 20-minute city related that people are talking about as well. This idea that actually how can we try and have everything on our doorstep, and how can we try and reduce our requirement for cars in particular. Well, I've got some thoughts about that, about that I think Ipswich should mull on in terms of how the strategy is rolled out. So the first thing to say is that from a job perspective, if we've seen that jobs have increasingly clustered, or high-skilled ones have increasingly clustered within city centres, that suggests that actually it's quite difficult for those jobs to be based anywhere, that they actually do want a very central location. And so the idea that actually we can have, you can sort of walk to your job that's going to be on your doorstep in your neighbourhood is probably quite a difficult one to implement. Those jobs, in successful places and high-skilled jobs are likely to want to still have that very central location. And indeed for workers too, if you can only choose a job that's within your neighbourhood, that very much shrinks the types of jobs that you might actually have access to. And so from a worker perspective, actually it's good to be able to access jobs outside your very immediate area. So from a jobs perspective, I think it will be difficult to attain this idea of being able to get to your job by foot or by a very short commute by cycling, for example. But for the other types of things that we access on a daily basis, such as restaurants, hospitals, other healthcare, local shops, etc., I think we should be trying to aspire to have them sort of within sort of the distance of a 10-minute cycle ride or a 10-minute walk. I think that's good from an environmental perspective as much as anything, and that's definitely a good thing to be trying to aim for. But the big challenge to, in the UK at least, to the idea of the connected city or the 15-minute city is that I'll have to see a radical change in how we plan our places. So I think in the UK we've had a history, certainly since the Second World War, of buildings of quite low density, housing developments, semi-detached houses, detached houses, over sort of those houses are spread out. Now, the problem of the 15-minute city idea is that if those developments are spread out, and so you actually have to get a car to go everywhere, and from the perspective of the restaurant, actually you're going to pull on a much larger catchment area in terms of area basis because you haven't got so many people living so locally. That means that it's going to be difficult to try and build up all those amenities in one place because you've got to have that clustering of people in one place in order to support those types of amenities. Indeed, that's why I think we do see the clustering of those types of amenities in big cities like London, for example, is because a lot of people living in a very small area. What that then means from a planning perspective is that we will have to build at higher densities. So the idea is the sort of low density suburbs that we've been building over the last 60 or 70 years will have to change, and we'll have to see more people living in those dense areas, which may not be everybody's cup of tea. And so there's a mindset element to change there, as well as a planning approach too. But really interesting to see the plans, and very much looking forward to the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much, Paul. I mean, I'm interested in your point there about density and how long do you think it's going to take to actually change public opinion in terms of moving away from going out to the suburbs to live and actually being content with living in a denser town and city centre?
I think it's something that does take a long period of time. I think it comes down to, in part, the different incentives that people face. I think if you look in a place like London, for example, and perhaps increasingly Manchester, I think the reason why people have come back to live in the city centre is because the benefits of living in the centre of London, the centre of Manchester, have radically changed over the last 30 years. So if we look at Manchester in the late 80s, very few people wanted to live there. That was because there weren't very many jobs there. It wasn't a particularly nice place to live. Crime was pretty high. But Manchester's gone through this period of sort of attracting in all of these jobs into the centre of Manchester, which has radically changed its attraction in terms of a place to live, because all of a sudden jobs are on the doorstep and people can walk to them. Those jobs then create a critical mass of people, which then create demand for bars, restaurants, cafes. So all these amenities spring up. And all of a sudden, people go, "Oh, actually, do you know what? Living in the centre is quite attractive offer now, because there are all these different things going on from a positive perspective, which offset the negatives, and there are definitely costs of living in a city centre: smaller space, more noisy, perhaps more pollution. You know, the benefits all of a sudden start to outweigh the costs, and that's why we're seeing sort of this renaissance in living in the centre of Manchester, for example. But I think there's also a generation element here, in that I think younger people are more likely to live in more dense developments, because of the different things that they look for and how they put value on certain types of amenities over different types of amenities, and that perhaps they do want to have the jobs on the doorstep, they do want to have the bars and the restaurants on the doorstep, and that appeals to them, and they're willing to make the trade-off. Whereas I think as we get a bit older and we start to have families, for example, all of a sudden that becomes less important, and it's more about access to good schools and access to green space. So I think that mindset shift probably will take a lot of time, but also it'll be certain types of demographic that will be more likely to embrace that than others. And I think it's about trying to manage that and understanding the different things that different people are looking for at different stages of their lives.
Yeah, I'm glad you're saying that younger people live in the town centre, because last year I moved into the heart of Ipswich, so I agree with you in that regard. In all seriousness, though, is it cyclical? Because young people in town and city centres, families perhaps moving out, but then when people get to perhaps children flying the nest and the empty nest syndrome, that actually town and city centre living becomes more popular again.
Well, the data at the moment doesn't suggest that has been going on in the UK, but it definitely is an interesting question as to whether that's something that actually policy should aspire to. Is it a case that those older people haven't been moving back because town and city centres are not offering the types of things that they could offer? But actually, if we were to make some policy interventions and change things around, perhaps that would change. I don't know exactly about whether that's the case or not. I think we need to do more research to understand why is that older people live where they do, and actually could we make changes that would then make sort of central urban living more attractive to them. So there's definitely questions still to be answered there.
Yeah, and in terms of you picked up on the issue of the car and the fact unless we have denser populations in our town centres, we're still going to have to battle with the car. That's a thorny issue, isn't it, for towns and cities across the country, about the payoff in terms of actually having the relationship between cars and people who live in our centres. Yeah,
definitely. I think clearly in the UK we're very attached to our cars, and I think the motorist lobby is quite strong, and that's understandable. Why would you want to go and wait for 15 minutes in the rain for a bus when actually you could go and jump in your car and get from A to B directly, rather than A to C and then having to walk to your final destination? But I think clearly we do see that in big places, in particular in dense places, we do see that all of a sudden public transport outweighs private transport travel, because the benefits of taking public transport are greater than the benefits of taking private transport. Now, a number of ways that we try and sort of manage people and discourage people to use their cars tends to be through congestion charging or bus lanes or restrictions of being able to drive in certain places, very much of the stick approach. And I think that's an important part of of trying to encourage people out of their cars, but it's not enough. I think we need to think about not just those direct measures, but actually sort of the indirect measures too, which brings me back to that planning point, in that people are much more likely to walk or cycle or take public transport if we do have more denser developments where you can better serve them by public transport because there's more people in one area, so there's more likely to be people who want to get on the bus, and so it's a profitable service to run. But also it's just easier to get around if actually you've got everything with it what you need within 5 minutes by walk, rather than actually I live in a housing estate and the nearest shop by hairdressers is a 10-minute drive away. So actually I'm going to do that because I've got a busy life and I'm going to drive there as opposed to walking for however long it would take to do. So it's that planning point again, which is central to this, but it doesn't really tend to be a very often placed at the centre of the conversation about how you try and get people out of their cars and what it needs to be if we are going to see that big change.
Paul, thanks very much indeed for that. Really interesting stuff there. Next up this morning is a great friend of Ipswich who's been a board member of ICM, so knows us well. Minnie Mole is now Chief Executive of the Design Council. She started her career as Managing Partner of HHCL, who were named Advertising Agency of the Decade, before working as Global Marketing Director of What If, a leading innovation company. She then became involved with leading and driving change in retail businesses, including Notcuts, the third largest garden centre group in the UK, as Joint Chief Executive of the East of England Co-op, and more latterly as Chief Executive of Gerald Retail. She was also voted Vistage Business Leader of the Year in 2020 and was listed as one of the 100 most inspirational women in Suffolk and Norfolk in 2018. Minnie has a strong sense of placemaking, which is key to her role within the Design Council. In addition, in 2016, she was appointed by Prince Charles to be his ambassador for responsible business in the East of England. This is in keeping with her views that businesses should do well and do good. So, Minnie, over to you.
Thank you, Terry. Design Council was set up back in 1944 by Winston Churchill's government to help Britain's economic recovery after the war. One can't help but draw some parallels with where we are now. Different times, different crisis, but if we are to build back better, then design is as relevant now as it was then. And in fact, if you layer on the net zero imperative, I would say that it's going to be even more critical. And I just must mention something here now, which is you may not know that from 1959 to 2011, Design Council worked closely with His Royal Highness Prince Philip on the Prince Philip Designers Prize. He was very hands-on. He created the prize. He was the chair of the judges. And he did an enormous amount in that period to raise the awareness of design and designers. So we mourn his loss. Today, Design Council works across sectors, but I would say our deepest expertise is in all things place. We get involved in some very big research projects, and we do quite a lot of work influencing government policy. It won't surprise you to know that we are involved in several programmes right now around renewing things like High Street Task Force that we're involved in, several other projects. But there's been one project we've been involved in just recently, as have Ipswich Central, that feels really central to today's conversation. And it's this. 20-Minute Neighbourhoods is an excellent report that has been produced by Town and Country Planning Association. As I say, we contributed, as did Ipswich Central. And I'm not going to go through all of these details here, but in the report, they include case studies from Paris, Portland, Oregon, and Melbourne, who are really ahead on this 20-minute neighbourhoods. And one of the interesting things is the absolute consistency about what they've identified as, if you like, the ingredients of a really successful 20-minute neighbourhood, the key ingredients for success. And it's pretty much these things on this circle that you can see here. What I am going to do is just dig into one of them a little bit, and it's the jobs and keeping money central. It's the business piece, if you like. It's already been touched on about business and why business is so important. That point that OJ mentioned about density of people being there in the towns and cities, it of course also has an incredibly positive impact on money in the morning, lunchtime and evening economy. So business is really key. There's another post-COVID imperative for the businesses in our towns and cities. We know that work is going to be more hybrid. We don't know exactly how it will pan out, but there will be people doing some work from home, some work from a workplace. So we need dynamic businesses to create really engaging, supportive environments that people want to go to work in. It's actually something that we're wrestling with ourselves at Design Council as we think about what space we want going forward. So there's a really important job there to create a space people want to leave their homes and come into. Digging even deeper than just business, let's just talk for a moment about retail. So what's going to happen to retail? Well, if the queues outside some of the Primark branches on Monday are anything to go by, retail is not dead yet. And indeed, my view is that retail will absolutely still be a part of what makes dynamic town and city centres. But of course, it is going to be different. To remind ourselves, the year before COVID was the worst year on record for high street retail. Online had already been growing. And of course, the massive acceleration of online in the last year. In January this year, January 21, the year-on-year sales online were 74% up. And since the pandemic started, 46% of British consumers have bought something online that they had previously only ever bought in store. So real behaviour change, and we will see a lot of that change rolling forward. So retailers that survive and thrive will be omnichannel mainly, which will be important. And so they'll need to rethink how the bricks and mortar part of their business works. And actually, I think that smart retailers already knew pre-COVID that they needed to be in the inspiration and entertainment and experience business. This is actually the Christmas fireworks at Jarrold department store in Norwich, where I worked previously. That department store has 6 restaurants and a fantastic food hall. And it's just an example of how the offer has been changing and morphing over time. It is also a salutary reminder that as we look at our towns and cities, there's going to be quite a lot of gaps. There's going to be some large central buildings that are empty, indeed lots of retail space that's empty, but some of those real anchor buildings, we need some smart thinking about what we do with them. Some of them may make some interesting residential. They can absolutely be showrooming, experience emporiums, if you will. I think, though, also this idea of blended use of space, healthcare, health and well-being, arts, community, and again, something OJ mentioned, this sort of layered use of space, which I think can lead to a very dynamic and very energetic feeling in our cities and towns. Business also helps create some really positive little ecosystems in a 20-minute neighbourhood. Here is the local environmentally friendly delivery team, business, that is delivering the local product and produce from the local retailer to the local customer in 3 hours. So you have happy customer. It's good for the customer, it's good for the environment, it's good for the economy, and it's good for the sense of community. And there have been lots and lots of lovely little entrepreneurial stories like this during COVID, and lots of very, very local collaboration. As I say, little ecosystems where businesses' role, I think, in helping be part of that 20-minute neighbourhood. At Design Council, we know that the best placemaking is really, really people-centred. This is actually New York, and New Yorkers really enjoying taking over their streets. And I share this for a key reason, which is an illustration of why we can make our towns and cities thrive, because it illustrates a fundamental human truth. We like to congregate, we like to come together, we like to have shared experience and see and be seen. And this is tarmac with some plants along the side, but has a lovely vibe about it. So it's this sense of being people-centered, and it's why it's so important to engage, listen, and co-design from the outset. I hope that this audience needs no convincing as to why we need to revision our towns and city centres. In terms of the what, there's some great work already done about what the ingredients are for a great town and city centre. I think the big question is the how. I think it's always about the how, excuse me, because the how is where the challenges are. The challenges of getting multiple stakeholders to align, the challenges of silos in local authorities and government, planning legislation restrictions, planning process, NIMBYism, deep-rooted and long-held sort of unhealthy relationships, and of course the very real challenge of investment and resource. These things kill innovation. So if we are to truly make these things happen, we need strong leadership, great vision, true selfless shared purpose, particularly around net zero, unprecedented levels of collaboration, authentic co-creation and inclusion. And my last point here is speed. COVID taught us that we can do things really fast when it is not business as usual. And I think we shouldn't let ourselves fall back into the old world timeframes that we make change happen. So if we can do these things here, then I think we have every chance to design back better our towns and our cities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minnie. Great to hear your thoughts there. I'm just going to pick up on a couple of things. You talked about planning regulation and the slide that you showed from New York, which I think many of us, most of us, would love to see in all of our towns and city centres. How tough is it though when our planning regulations and our planning authorities can still be very stuck in their ways, and despite government intervention?
I think it's a matter of stuck in their ways, but I also think that my point about speed. We have to look at the ways that, whatever the process, that it happens quicker. We have to be able to do it more quickly, and I think. Yes, I don't want to, give a bad rap to planners. I think there's lots of very dynamic planners, and we actually are working with lots of planners. I think the point is about shared vision. If we come together and have shared vision, then it makes it easier to actually break down what we need to happen to deliver it.
You also talked, and I'm going to pick up on your experience from retail, Minnie. You talked about Primark at the queues in our towns and cities yesterday for Primark, a brand that has no digital presence at all. Do you have to be a low price retailer to exist in our current world without a digital presence? And what does that mean for others that perhaps are more traditional retailers at a higher price point?
I think there is a squeezed middle. I think the low price retailers like Primark, have an incredible business, and it's a strong offer. And I think at the other end, where it's very much more experiential, take some department stores and certainly other brands where you want to come, touch, feel, smell, sit on the furniture. I think there's a real opportunity there, which very often is in the higher end purchasing. I think that area can absolutely thrive. to some extent, and it's again back to something that OJ said, I think, is there has been a middle rump in retail where, frankly, a lot of it hasn't been good enough. It hasn't been differentiated. It hasn't been that interesting or exciting. And I think that's where the retail sector has already been most hard hit. So that middle area where there's not the differentiation. So because you can, commodity stuff will be bought online. Experiential stuff is where I think there's an opportunity for retailers to still thrive.
Minnie, thanks very much. Great to have you with us this morning. Still to come between now and midday, Ipswich Central CEO Paul Clement with his presentation on the connected town model and a panel discussion involving a cross-section of businesses and specialists with an investment in Ipswich Town Centre. Don't forget to comment about today's speakers and discussions. Tweet us at IpswichBid using the hashtag Reviving Urban Centres. Well, our next speaker is Steve Walker. Steve is an architect and director at Allies and Morrison. He works at the early stages of visions, frameworks and urban master planning, usually at the formation of planning policy and often involving community engagement and building consensus in the context of urban change. For Steve, master planning is an opportunity to improve the lives of the individuals and communities who make up the fabric of our cities. Steve produced our Ideas for Ipswich document in 2018, which we've used consistently to help inform our future strategy. Steve Walker.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for inviting me to share some thoughts. I'd like to just start by touching on the Ideas for Ipswich document, if I may. I think it was an invitation back in 2018 to look ahead and see where Ipswich might be going. But of course, what we couldn't possibly have imagined was where we would find ourselves now. It's completely changed and accelerated the way things have been moving. But I think we've learned a huge amount through the process. I think as the previous speakers have talked about, I think we've learned that we can do things incredibly quickly in terms of the way we treat our spaces and we treat our town centres. But I think it's also given us a renewed appreciation of what's local and what's important. And I think this connected town idea of somewhere that is livable and dense enough to have that critical mass of people, where you've got a diversity of uses and they're accessible within a short walk or bike ride, and somewhere that is sustainable and healthy as something that we can plan for the very long term is a really robust way of thinking about our towns. And we've all had, or I hope you've had, the pleasure of being on holiday in lovely towns and cities where you get to amble through intimate streets and spaces and sit in street cafes, whether it's Galway, the capital of culture, or whether it's sitting in Paris and walking through neighbourhoods in Paris. That whole process of being in towns and cities is a positive, a lovely experience for a lot of people in lots of places. And I think as we start to ask ourselves, how do we make Ipswich a 15-minute town? A good question to ask is, when did it stop being a 15-minute town? And actually, we have a great bone structure to work with here. If we look at the 15-minute walk from the central catchment, it picks up all of that urban centre. And if we overlay this with some of the historic maps that we've got access to, the original medieval core of that was all within that 15-minute walk, and even the late Victorian town, almost all of the neighbourhoods and all of the centre and all of the workplaces and all of the industry and all of the economy was in that central 15-minute walk. So it has been and remains a really powerful idea for the way cities work. And Ipswich is blessed with tremendous historic character, of fantastic sets of buildings, beautiful variety across both the industrial and the domestic and the civic, and then also some lovely places that people really want to be. We've worked very hard on things like those intimate lanes and the main shopping streets to turn them into really positive, pleasant spaces. So there's a huge amount that we're starting from as a positive base here. But in terms of thinking about and understanding what might be improved and where we could change things is looking at the difference between the Victorian street pattern and the big highway network that's been laid into that, the kind of investment over the last 60 or 70 years in making it possible for cars to cut through the town centre has made a big impact on the fabric of the place, and in particular, the way that the Star Lane and Key Street gyratory cuts off the town centre from the waterfront and creates this big gash in the fabric of the town. So we started to think, what could be the kind of key moves for making Ipswich a 15-minute town again, and where might we start to draw some inspiration? And it's worth taking that historic model and thinking about all of those towns which Ipswich over the centuries has traded with and has many things in common with, except nationality. If we look at some of our European neighbours, you might be tempted to say, but we're not Amsterdam, we're not Copenhagen, or we're not Utrecht. But actually, you don't have to go very far back through their history to see that they have been through a similar process of changing from a very car-dominated, high car usage environment to a place which prioritises walking and prioritises cycling and cherishes the kind of urban qualities. And Utrecht is another good example where a very significant highways infrastructure was driven through in the post-war period, but they're now in the process of reclaiming the environment, of reinstating the historic canal, of putting those roads on a bit of a diet and stopping them being so hungry in terms of the space, and reclaiming that history and that heritage within their town centre. And I think the results speak for themselves, really. These huge amounts of tarmac being stripped away to make much more kind of rational, sensible spaces, and they still work for the car. These places, have very high car ownership, just like Ipswich and its wider rural hinterland. So there's very strong precedents for what you can do with a town like Ipswich. Another good precedent could well be somewhere like Groningen, which is a big town with a very rural hinterland, so it has lots of the same sort of dynamics as Ipswich. There, they've managed to achieve 60% of all journeys by bicycle, by making those local trips on foot or by bike really easy, and by making it hard to drive through the town. You can drive to, you can park, but then you leave your car and you walk that last bit. And so it's been a major change of taking key streets that used to cut through the centre of their medieval city, and turn those into places where people want to spend time, want to sit outside, and are much greener and more attractive. So I'd like to leave you with kind of three key thoughts, really, and these I'm glad that these are starting to really echo and apply some of the points that our other speakers have made to Ipswich and the particular solutions. And firstly, I think that point about the town centre really wanting to be dense and diverse. We talked about how do you make a really attractive, dense environment? I don't think we're talking about tower blocks everywhere. We're talking about somewhere that has, is sort of Victorian plus in terms of its density. Those sorts of you can still make really attractive streets and spaces, but it is about achieving that critical mass and diversifying what has been a very successful retail centre into something where actually we're seeing a much greater mix of things coming in about community uses, about cultural spaces, it is about homes, but it's also about creative enterprise and workspace. And I think that point about workspace, about making things locally, about meeting needs locally, whether it's making whether it's roasting coffee or brewing beer or baking or making jeans or making and repairing furniture, those sorts of things are things that can happen really locally and will be a really positive asset to the town. There's plenty of space for this to be happening. There are big slack areas of land at the moment where Ipswich really does need a coordinated framework of streets and spaces that start to repair the urban fabric and create a dense new neighbourhood that sits alongside the original medieval heart. There's then, I think, the point about streets for people, and we've learned a huge amount about how our streets work through lockdown. And I think that the point that's been made already about trying to recalibrate the balance between car use and walking and cycling, I think is really important. And in our Ideas for Ipswich document, we looked at the Star Lane and Key Street area and the links that take the kind of elements of remaining historic fabric and start to look at all those streets that cut down from the town centre and start to join you into the waterfront, how we can start to really repair that in a sensitive and sensible way, and turn what is currently an inhospitable gyratory into somewhere that people want to spend time, people want to be, and where those walking connections really work well. And then finally, I think the point that we've really got to grips with in terms of our town centres is wanting them to be attractive, livable places. And I think this point really does bear emphasis, given that we want more people to be living in the town centre. And I think the point that was raised earlier about whether you can persuade families to live in the town centre, I think is a really good test, actually, of whether you're being successful. You know, thinking about design for all ages, for all people, for children as well as for younger people, as well as for family age adults, as well as for older people. I think if we can touch on all of those demographics and make space for everybody to be in the town, we really will achieve a successful place. And a common thread to all of this, I think, is more greenery. Whether it's little pocket parks, whether it's larger spaces, it's creating a much greener, softer, more attractive environment. And this isn't only about our own kind of wellness and health. This is also about responding to the biodiversity crisis that we're struggling with, and it's also about helping our spaces be really resilient to the impacts and effects of climate change, and actually helping us address that, whether it's through sustainable drainage so that we manage water runoff, whether it's through providing shade as well. All of these things, you know, they make our spaces more attractive and places people want to spend time, but they have these multiple layers of benefit. So I think the thought that I'll leave you with is it was the ninth idea in our ideas for Ipswich, but it was the idea of taking this riverside edge that is currently really underappreciated and thinking about that as an opportunity to create a new linear park that takes you all the way along the waterside edge. Starts to link together the railway station, the harbour, and then also it forms the basis of what could be potentially a great new neighbourhood stitching into the medieval heart of the town. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Terry.
Great stuff, Steve. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to come back to you because I can probably hear lots of people who are saying, OK, well, I can understand families being very happy to come into the town centre and having less traffic. Let's lose the car. It'll be a lot safer and a much nicer environment. But of course, bids represent businesses, and in our case, about 630 odd businesses in Ipswich. So how do we square that circle for businesses? How do we make sure that they see the benefit of the sort of change in which you're talking about?
I think for lots of businesses, a particular important thing to bear in mind is that as you get more people living in the town centre, the catchment of those businesses in terms of their walkable catchment really ramps up. So I think that's the first important point. And then I think the second important point is that there's a huge amount of data that's emerging now from places like areas of London that have had experimental funding to implement walking and cycling infrastructure, that actually where you do it and where you do it well, the businesses benefit and really do benefit. And I think lots of the findings from those studies show that there was businesses overestimate how many of their customers come by car and underestimate how many come on foot. And that actually, if you make it an attractive place to be and to spend time and make that really easy and working well, then businesses do thrive. I think the important thing to emphasise, though, is that this isn't about making Ipswich completely inaccessible by car. We do still want the residential hinterland to be connected in. We know that some people will definitely need to keep using a car, and we know that some businesses will need to be able to do pick up and drop off and do those kind of click and collect elements. So we've got to have a kind of balance of how it works, but certainly there are a lot of good lessons that we can learn from existing precedents on that.
And talk to me about the importance of green space. You talked about pocket parks, and of course you illustrated the Riverside Park suggestion that you came up with a couple of years ago. It seems to be much more important as we go forward. People are looking at this with perhaps much more a sense of urgency perhaps than before.
Yeah, and I think it's partly through lockdown that everybody who has a garden or a balcony or a park nearby has spent way more time sitting in it than they ever dreamed they would. And I think we've really begun to appreciate it, and particularly with the restrictions on travel, we've also really begun to appreciate the things that are right on our doorstep. And like lots of people, through lockdown, I've walked my local area much more and explored my local area much more than I ever have before. So I think that kind of local element of tiny green spaces where you can go and sit, where you can meet neighbours, where you can meet a friend, where your kids can potter about and play for a short while, all make a place much more livable and much more attractive. I think it is really important to emphasise the other two key elements, though, which is about the biodiversity and the benefits we get from that, and the climate change resilience. I think that it's touching on all a whole series of aspects, all of which are really important.
Steve, thank you very much indeed for your presentation today.
Thank you.
And so to our final presentation from Paul Clement, who's our CEO here at the Ipswich Central Bid and all about Ipswich DMO. Paul has a long history in the management and development of numerous UK town and city centres, having established his own consultancy in 2011 and more recently as Savills Head of Place Shaping. Paul helped to set up the 30th UK bid here in Ipswich back in 2006. As a proud Ipswich boy and having lived and worked from here for all of his life, today's ambition for the town is important to him. So with that in mind, Paul's here to tell us about that ambition and what being the UK's first connected town will really mean for his hometown. Paul, over to you.
Thank you and good morning, everybody. So this is a case study. We're not saying that we've got all the right answers here at Ipswich. What we are saying, though, is we have got a plan that we'd like to discuss with everybody and we'd like you to start to understand. So the plan is to create UK's first connected town centre. So it's built on the models of the 15 and 20-minute town centre. Yes, it is definitely, but it's not the purest view. And I think that was the thing that Paul Swinney was telling us, which is the purest view is imagine you are living in a place and you never have to go outside of it. Well, that's unrealistic for a place like Ipswich. But what we can do is do better inside that space and have many more people living within it. So what you see on screen now is a view of Ipswich from the north. In the bottom of the screen is Terry Baxter's country home. Oh no, that's the Ipswich mansion. And as you can see in the south is the real jewel in our crown, which is our waterfront. So we started on this journey actually in 2015. This isn't something that we've dreamt up for this conference. In 2015, we came up with the strategy of better connecting our waterfront with our commercial core, where most retailers and most office occupiers are. And it was turning the town through an axis so that north-south links started to be prioritised over east-west links. And that was the strategy that we came up with in 2015. So what you're hearing about today is a progression of that strategy. It is not something that is new. And Ipswich's history is its waterfront. The reason we are here is because of our port and the portside industrial buildings that employed so many of our ancestors. So when you look at futuring a place, when you look at a future vision or a future plan, it's always a good idea just to turn through 180 degrees and think, well, actually, why is the place here in the first place? Because when you find that, you normally find what you can go back to and start to prioritise in the future. And Ipswich's portside location means that it has a history of being a connected town centre. As Steve started to tell us, not just internally within England and the UK, but externally as a route through out to Europe and a route from Europe into the UK. So locationally, it's got a huge amount of advantages. So this is where we've started. We've always gone back to this really simple principle, which is, what is our roots? What's our history? Where do we come from? Let's be true to it. Let's not try and reinvent it. The next is the physical side of a town centre. How does it actually operate? And as Steve started to tell us, there are bits of Ipswich that physically don't operate in the way that we want and actually create some barriers to the future that we're heading for. But here's the real deal. The real deal is, how do we want people to think about it, to feel about it? because places are born not through physicality, but they're born through the stories that we tell one another about those places. So people need to be emotionally attached to this plan for the future and feel that they have a stake in the game, that they're invested in it, and that we're going in a direction that they want us to proceed in and they want to follow us in. Now, Bill Grimsey's talked quite a lot about how local leadership is important in creating visions for the future. I agree with that principle. I disagree with him in that he quite often says it needs to sit with one individual, be it a mayor, council leader, a bid chair, or so on. I don't think that's correct. And I think in places like Ipswich, you need to actually have a collective group of stakeholders. So this is our collective group, which goes from our MP to our borough council, county council, the LEP, our Chamber of Commerce, the university, and then our two organisations as well. And we've always enjoyed massive support from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, who've seen Ipswich quite often as being a sort of forward mover and something that is well worth investing in. And I'll tell you about their latest investment later. Now, where we have done well is that we've held this group together since 2015, irrespective of political changes or changes of personality. These organisations have continued to sit around the table, meet every single month, share a common view, share a common strategy, and make it happen. So this is a long set of words, and I'm not planning on reading it all out, but this is our vision statement. This is what we want people to be saying as we progress through this plan over the next 5 years. But the bits that are highlighted in the pinky colour are the most important. One, it's got to feel connected. It's got to be compact. People need to think that it's usable, livable, vibrant, and differentiated. Differentiated both in the terms of its fabric, but differentiated also in terms of the experience that you have when you go there every day. You wouldn't go to a cinema and see the same film 5 days a week. You'll go to the cinema 5 days if the attraction gets you there and you see something different. That needs to be how you feel when you go to town and city centres. There needs to be something different every day. So, what have we done wrong in the past? Well, the first thing is this is a splendid church that sits literally midway between the waterfront and the town centre. And look what we did in the mid-last century. We built a whole raft of buildings around it that actually created confused routes through, and you could not literally walk from the waterfront to the town centre. But we did clear them. And what we then did is we put a gyratory system in place of the building. So we created an even less permeable barrier between the two. And this is one of the issues we know we have to solve, and it's difficult, but we've got to solve people thinking that this is not a barrier and they can walk, cycle through it and connect the two areas of the town centre. Now, this could be your town or city centre. It's very typical. We were a bit busier than this yesterday, let's say, but this is what has happened. Retailers over the last 10, 20 years have been prepared to pay whatever it takes to occupy the building that they want in a prime spot. They've not really been bothered about the fact the building is 3 or 4 stories high, because all they want is that ground floor, grade A, zone A space. And therefore what you've ended up with is vacancy rates in terms of frontage of, let's say, 10 to 15%, depending on your location. But you do what we've done in Ipswich and look at it on an unused floor space basis. And suddenly you find that probably nearly half your town or city centre is vacant and could be brought back to life. Remember, a lot of these buildings were built as houses, not as shops. It's just that the retailers were prepared to pay whatever it took, and what they did then was they forced other uses out from the centre. So this guy's made a fair few headlines. Our connected town is a progression of the 15-minute city, but where I think Carlos Marino in Paris is right is he talks about proximity, density and diversity, but he does say you cannot create a connected place without inputting digital over it. We can sit here absolutely and believe that we can fight online retail. We won't win. So what we ought to be doing is embracing digital and making place bring digital even more to life. And that's the challenge. And you'll hear about some funding we've got for that in a few moments. So does it work across a town or city centre? Marino's model is to build 15-minute neighbourhoods around Paris. Can we do this in one place across a whole town centre? Well, ironically, I can walk from the football club on the left-hand side of your screen to the university on the right-hand side of the screen in 15 minutes. But actually better than that, if I wanted you to come to Ipswich for a weekend, you're probably going to arrive at the station. I'm definitely going to want you to go and see that waterfront because it's incredible. But I want you to go and see that park you saw on the screen in the first place, because it's one of the largest green spaces in the country. And I can get from all of those points in no more than 15 minutes. So from a visitor's perspective, they can arrive, they can stay, they can enjoy, and they can experience things that they can't get in their own location, and they don't have to do anything other than walk or cycle. So we do have a plan here that can be made to work. And Terry Baxter's statement, and I'm going to quote him his own statement here because he's expressed this better for me than anybody else, which is, what I want is more people living centrally, but then having around them everything they need to live their lives locally. And imagine the transformation that will happen in a town or city centre if you had that, yeah? Suddenly you start to open up different kind of uses that need to be around them. Doctor surgeries, medical centres, churches, faith centres, markets. Suddenly it becomes a different kind of place. It's no longer transactionary. I'm not just going to go in and shop. I'm actually going to be there and it's going to be my home. But the connected town concept doesn't look inwards within 15 minutes. So we want to reach out to our hinterland and we want people within, let's say, 15, 20 minutes drive time of Ipswich Borough Council's boundary to feel that this is a centre that they want to be part of as well. And it then goes further internally. We know that hybrid working models are going to mean that people might be in the office 3 days a week, working from home 2 days a week. So we need to invest in district centres, not compete with them, but embrace them as part of this model. But then we need to go further still, because Ipswich is a commuter town. Lots of people go to London and historically have worked there 5 days a week. Now they may be working there 3 days a week. So we need to give them a place where they can work satisfactorily those 2 days, even if they're going to commute in and out 3 days a week. So back to MHCLG, we've just been awarded town deal funding of 25 million, and some of the projects that we're going to do, 11 projects are in front of you. But you cannot create a connected town just by bringing buildings back into use. We have to bring the place back to life. So the two things I want to focus on here are firstly, £600,000 in terms of green trails, but then our project, which is to digitalise the town centre, so that when you are there with your phone or your smart device, aspects of the town come to life in a way that they simply cannot do if you're sitting on your sofa buying from an online retailer. We're not saying you can't buy from an online retailer. What we're saying is when you come into town, you get a different kind of experience. And let's be honest, old habits of retail, we heard from Minnie, are coming to an end and will change. So this is about living differently and having the amenities around you that you need to live your life. It's about more people working in their own businesses, perhaps living above their shops. It's about people being able to get around more easily, not necessarily having to go by car. It's about bringing routes back into a more useful life so that they become a pleasure to walk or cycle along. It's about bringing huge buildings that may sit vacant for part of each day, week or year back into life 24/7. We can use these assets. And it's about transforming streets so that they're places that you want to go to and you want to be seen in. And it is definitely about reconnecting the waterfront with the town centre, and that's something the Vision Board are going to have to focus upon. So the big aspect of this is it needs to be people first. It needs to be built from us, the residents of Ipswich. And so Terry, back to you. Let the discussion begin.
Thanks very much, Paul. Well, let's start that discussion with a panel made up of Gurpreet Jagpal, Pro Vice-Chancellor of Business and Entrepreneurship at the University of Suffolk, Marta Holden, Associate at Stanley Bragg Architects, Sarah Holmes, Chief Executive, New Wolsey Theatre, Mandy Errington, owner of independent retailer DJV Boutique, and John Howard, Property Developer, Investor and Managing Director of Wharf Developments, along with Florence Irvine, Marketing Manager from Friel. Okay, well, let's come to you, Flo, first of all. As a young professional working in Ipswich, what's the thing that most excites you about the connected town concept for Ipswich?
I think, firstly, having grown up in Ipswich and seeing how it has slowly changed throughout the years, the concept of a connected town is very exciting. I think as we well, to refer to what OJ said earlier about being within almost another revolution at the moment, we are in a technological revolution. And I think digitisation of the high streets, making everything a little bit more connected, it will help Ipswich to adapt. You know, we need to adapt and prepare now, otherwise we are potentially going to be left behind. But it is very exciting to see everything that could potentially be on your doorstep. It's going to be dynamic, it's going to be fresh, it's going to be exciting, and I may not need to go to London, you know, if I want to go and experience something a little bit different, because it's all going to be on the doorstep. So I think it's a very exciting time, and it would be very rewarding to see this through to the other side.
And Sarah, from a culture and arts perspective, we've heard from a lot of our speakers today about it being important to have experiences in our town centre. What role will your sector play in that?
Absolutely essential that you bring arts and culture and heritage into the transformation of the town. We are all about celebration, bringing people together, creating events. And there is plenty of opportunity of expertise in Ipswich, and a lot of it at the moment is based in buildings. They will continue to have a part to play in bringing people into the town and using other facilities. But I think we also need to start reaching out to more outdoor and more events and experiences and stories and cultural activity that brings people unsuspectingly into enjoyment.
John, I wanted to come to you actually. As a private investor already involved in developing a number of properties in Ipswich, what role must the private sector take, and what are you looking for to help you get there?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, first of all, I think all the speakers have been absolutely brilliant today. It's been really interesting to listen to them. And I think actually Minnie hit it on the head. I think she was trying to be relatively subtle about it. But, you know, the local authority need to support private enterprise, which, to be fair, in Ipswich, that they've done to a point. They need to do a lot more. We need to cut the red tape. I mean, town centres, there's far too many shops, let's face it. And, you know, what they should be doing is buying up the vacant shops, or someone should be changing them into other uses, so that there is then a demand for shops in Ipswich town centre, which I know you could argue might drive rents up, and one or two people on this call may not be happy with that, but you need demand. You know, if there's no, you know, it's you know, if no one wants to watch a football match, you can't charge any money for it, and that's the problem. You know, there's no value in a lot of it. In terms of connecting the town centre to the waterfront, you know, we've just done the deal with McCarthy and Stone, which is a massive. It's going to be, they're building 70 quality homes between the waterfront and the town centre, Lower Brook Street. That's a massive gain for Ipswich, huge gain in my view. The other areas haven't been developed because of archaeological problems. So, you know, there needs to be subsidies. You know, the government and the local authority needs to be dynamic. Brownfield sites are a massive issue. When Robert Jennett was down, and I walked him around some of these with Tom Hunt, our MP, you know, I thought he got it, but he hasn't done anything to help.
Yeah, I mean, archaeological preparation of sites has always been a potential barrier in attracting investors. But there could be a role there for the town deal funding, certainly the reviving the town fund element of that to contribute in that way.
I'm delighted to hear it, absolutely delighted to hear it. And that will really, all those vacant sites along the waterfront and between the waterfront and the town, you know, they can then be developed, which is exciting. And of course, Suffolk County Council bottled the bridge situation, completely bottled it in my view. I spoke to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who said get them to gear it up, and they were 40 million short in the end. Suffolk County Council bottled it. That's why there's so much traffic between the town centre and the waterfront. Simple as that.
The really important thing, though, is that we have a vision group in Ipswich, as Paul referred to, that are working together and are committed to try and overcome those issues. Marta, from a planning point of view, you've heard the speakers this morning. How do you think the connected town here in Ipswich will fare with all of those issues that have been brought up today?
I think this partnership that has been mentioned and the engagement of everyone in a joint discussion is really important, because there are spatial strategies being developed. We talked about the transport links. We talked about specific sites being developed, and I think where all of this needs to come together now is in that joint discussion and planning of the specific projects, because we do have a vision. The vision is fantastic. We need to make it happen now. And how do we make it happen is transferred into real projects, which Paul actually mentioned that there are already planned. So this vision for Ipswich of Ipswich where you want to live in, the place to be, the connected town, so improvement of possible refurbishment of certain buildings into residential, bringing more people to live in town. That's one thing. Looking at the areas which are already underdeveloped in town, how we can improve on those, so this living status of town, but also Ipswich as a destination. So this is kind of a second layer to it. So be in living, but Ipswich as a destination, and that difficult link between the pedestrian and the car transport. This is where the engagement with the council needs to come in as well. And the third thing I would mention is finding this town's identity. Something that has been mentioned, because people want to identify themselves with Ipswich. And what do we identify ourselves with? In all of those discussions, there's been mentioning of the Christchurch area, of the Marina area, the central town, the Portman Road. All of those links have their own identities. They need to be linked into this vision for Ipswich and what it means. And is it shopping? Is it retail? Is it living in Ipswich? Sports and leisure, all of that being in one place, that's great. And now we need to reach out to the residential areas that are probably outside as well. So where we're talking about the town centre, 15 minutes links, we also have traffic coming from Norwich Road. We have the Stoke part, we have the Woodbridge part. Those people cycle, those people work, those people take buses. So development of those sustainable transport links, it all needs to come together. So there is a lot of work.
Sorry to interrupt.
Go.
But I mean, you've picked up on a lot of points that, in fact, I think Paul was talking about in terms of you can have the 15-minute town, but you also need to connect to other areas of Ipswich for their own specific hubs. I want to talk about higher education. We have our university here right in the heart of town by our lovely marina. Gurpreet, good morning to you. What role will HE or can HE play in the development, the positive development of Ipswich going forward?
I think the university itself, its location on the waterfront, is a really attractive destination for students. And it's how do we develop that waterfront area to make it even more attractive? What other facilities do we put in place so it becomes an educational destination of choice, and people look at Ipswich and look at the University of Suffolk and look at the education provision as an opportunity for them to go and learn. And I think from that is looking at how those individuals develop the skills and the knowledge to then continue to have a base in Ipswich, continue to have a presence, and begin to take their first rung of the employment ladder and grow their career around Ipswich. So I think education's got a really critical role to play in the university in particular, in terms of working both in terms of attracting students to the area, but then also with the business community to ensure that we can create the jobs and the opportunities for these young students, these young graduates, to then stay in the region and contribute to the development of Ipswich, to contribute to the GDP, and to create and support the growth of businesses in the area.
Let me come to Mandy. From a retailer's point of view, Mandy, you've got a strong brand as an independent retailer in our town centre. Do you think that the connected town centre model, that more condensed town centre, plays in very much into the benefit of our independent retailers?
The opportunity that we've been presented with here is, I think, is very exciting and quite igniting for the retail sector, particularly being a small business. I think the prospects for Ipswich are very, very, like I said, exciting, and I'm very much looking forward to getting on board.
How do you think we get more independent retailers across the board to actually see Ipswich as a way forward?
I think, like Minnie referred to, really, it's about creating an experience and becoming more dynamic with our retail offers. And I think it's very important to look at exploring how we can be more diverse and present something that's more attractive for shoppers. And I think unconventional retailing is actually conventional retailing has obviously changed quite dramatically. So we do have to move forward, and this is a way to do that and catapult into the future. Certainly embracing the digital age as well.
John, in terms of getting more investment, more private investment into it, so you touched on planning and you touched on some of the work that would be needed to be done to underpin some of the early preparation work. We seem, despite the pandemic, to be at a time now where there's a degree of optimism in terms of development, in terms of building. And with Ipswich's connectivity particularly to the capital, an hour away from London, why aren't we seeing more investment coming to places like Ipswich?
Well, I think part of the problem is we're like self-harmers. I mean, we're constantly knocking Ipswich. I mean, when you talk to my friends and other people, you know, they don't want to go into Ipswich town centre. Perhaps it's a people problem, perhaps it isn't. But you know, we're so well located. I mean, I bang the drum constantly about Ipswich and Suffolk, and we're so well located. And I think we've just sold ourselves very, very short over the last 10, 20 years because it's a great place to live. You've only got to look at the waterfront to see if you put a quality development in, people will come. I mean, the wine rack, for instance, we've got people moving down from London, from all over the country and abroad to come and live in Ipswich, which is amazing and absolutely fantastic. But, you know, we have the police, for instance, have moved out the town centre. That's caused a problem. You know, we need to get the police to invest more constables in the town centre and help the crime rates and things like that. Because people, when they look to buy property, and developers look at this, they look at crime rates and things like that and say, well, you know, is there a problem? Isn't there a problem in a particular area? And it does make a difference, as does connectivity. So certainly, you know, the internet and so on is very, very important these days to people when they're buying a property.
And Sarah, I want to come back to you. You know, we talked about culture and arts being able to support the development of our town going forward. But that needs investment. I mean, that needs investment. You've been very successful, actually, locally, and I know Dance East has also received a good level of investment. But it doesn't stop, does it? We still need to be attracting more, and we need to keep reminding people that we're here.
Yes, but I would say that arts and culture isn't supporting so much as it's absolutely vital. I think that whole ability for our sector to make placemaking real, to bring people together, to enliven and interest and celebrate, tell the stories, create new, different, exciting experiences. And you know, you're right about the digital aspects. OJ's right about the Industrial Revolution. Let's make the most of it and bring more things to happen. Yes, there's a resource issue, and I think one of your speakers was absolutely clear about it. Was Paul, I think, who was absolutely. We need more investment, and we need to be making sure that we are so special and so adventurous and so sure of what we wanted to achieve that we are an attractive place to invest in. And it is an investment. It's not necessarily throwing money at something to make it pretty. It really is investing in quality of life, investing in economic development.
And Florence, we're looking at the future of the town. Many of us who sit around the vision board table perhaps are not in the first flushes of youth. So we very much need to take on board the views of all members of the community in Ipswich. With your social base and your contact base, are young people actually now seeing Ipswich in a different way, or have they yet to be convinced by the proposals going forward?
I think I can see it from both views. I grew up in Ipswich and I didn't used to see, it was just somewhere that you grew up. I never really saw it as somewhere that I actually wanted to base myself, to be completely honest with you. I just didn't see the dynamic element of it. And then I spent some time out of the country. I spent some time in different cities where they did have this connected element to it. And then coming back to Ipswich, I think I was probably out for away for about 5 years. And then having seen the transformation really quickly with my own eyes, I actually felt excited to be a resident of Ipswich. And there's so many elements that are included in this. It's, diversity, it's embracing, local culture. But the two key elements that I think are super, super important, especially as the next generation start finishing school and start looking for jobs and start debating whether or not they want to leave this area, is the green and sustainable element of it. Absolutely. We are in a climate crisis and this is very, very important, but also the digital aspect. The generation underneath us are digital natives. I'm in an age where I remember having in 2008 when the first credit crunch and everything happened, I had like a flip phone. Everything is completely different now. Like the digital natives, they don't remember a time with no Wi-Fi. They're going to expect things. They want things fast. They have shorter attention spans. Everything needs to be adapted and prepared for when they are going to be living and working in this area. And I think if we do it now and we do it right, we won't get left behind.
And Gurpreet, coming back to you, in terms of digital Ipswich going forward, which obviously we believe will play a major part, that must chime with research and work that's happening at the university right now.
It certainly does, and digital literacy is a big part of that, and ensuring that graduates are leaving with those digital skills to be able to make use of the opportunities that will come from being a connected town. And also the investment into digital research, digital degree provision is also significant within the university and for the region. So we are seeing a lot more investment going into digital and supporting those digital skills within graduates and those entering the workforce in the future. My challenge, I suppose, to us all would be, what do we do in terms of upskilling those that have already left education, and how do we continually keep people up to date with the pace of that technological change? So if we go back to what OJ was talking about, the fourth industrial revolution, this is by far one of the fastest industrial revolutions, and it's running at a pace that we would struggle, or most people are struggling to keep up with. So how do we ensure that individuals are capable and have the skills to be able to reskill on an almost continual basis as technology changes, as we embrace more technology, and as our town becomes more connected with the use of technology? We need to make sure that is accessible by by all citizens within Ipswich, within Suffolk, and those that then come to visit as well.
Gurpreet, thanks very much, and thanks to all of our attendees, contributors, vision partners, the ICM board and levy payers, and the All About Ipswich board and members. If you're local to Ipswich, together with our vision partners, we'll be inviting you to take part in the Connected Town consultation process, the details of which will be released shortly. Whether you're local, national or international, keep watching and join us on our journey to a connected town as that continues. Thanks again for being with us today. Stay safe and well, and have a good day.